Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind troubled with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Let my voice wash over you at a comfortable volume and allow yourself to be distracted from the stresses and worries that play on your mind. Whether you need help falling asleep or going back to sleep in the middle of the night, you can trust me to keep you company and help you to wake up tomorrow in a rested state. You may need to try out Sleepy Time Tales for a few nights to get used to the slightly strange idea, but I believe it will be well worth your while. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So settle down, relax, and allow yourself to get lost in my telling of tonight's story. Before we get to tonight's reading, I'd like to ask for a few minutes of your time. Sleepy Time Tales is a listener-supported podcast. I can only keep it going by paying for the services and tools that I use, and justify the time that I spend on it thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. So if you find Sleepy Time Tales useful, if it helps you to get a restful night, and you would like to keep it going out to thousands of insomniacs just like you, and you have the means, please consider supporting it on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that not only helps me keep the lights on, but can get you fun bonuses based on your contribution level. So go along there, take a look, and sign up if you're willing and interested. Of course, if monthly seems like a big ask, you can make once-off tips and contributions to the tip jar on the website. And if you would like to help out Sleepy Time Tales without having to do so financially, you can do a lot to help the show grow by just telling people about it. If you know someone who's struggling to get some sleep, just tell them about Sleepy Time Tales and see if it works for them. That's enough of that. Let's get to the secret garden, enjoying nature, and temper tantrums. Thanks so much. We're returning this week to The Secret Garden by Hodgson Burnett. Mary told him her story about the midnight wuthering of the wind which had wakened her, and about the faint, far-off sounds of the complaining voice, which had led her down the dark corridors with her candle, and had ended with her opening of the door of the dimly lighted room, with the carven four-poster bed in the corner. When she described the small ivory-white face and the strange black-rimmed eyes, Dickon shook his head. "Them's just like his mother's eyes, only hers was always laughing, they say," he said. "They say as Mr. Craven can't bear to see him when he's awake, and it's because his eyes are so like his mother's, and yet look so different in his miserable bit of a face." "Do you think he wants to die?" whispered Mary. "No, but he wishes he'd never been born. Mother, she says that's the worst thing on earth for a child. Them as is not wanted scarce ever thrives. Mr. Craven, he'd buy anything his money could buy for the poor lad, but he'd like to forget as he's on earth. For one thing, he's afraid he'll look at him one day and find he's growed a hunchback." "Colin's so afraid of it himself he won't sit up," said Mary. "He says he's always thinking that if he should feel a lump coming, he should go crazy and scream himself to death." He oughtn't to lie there thinking of things like that," said Dickon. "No lad could ever get well as thought of them sort of things." The fox was lying on the grass close by, looking up to ask for a pat now and then. Dickon bent down and rubbed his neck softly, and thought for a few minutes in silence. Presently he lifted his head and looked around the garden. When first we got in here, he said, it seemed like everything was grey. Look around now and tell me that doesn't see a difference. Mary looked and caught her breath a little. Why, she cried, the grey wall is changing. It is as if a green mist were creeping over it, and it's almost like a green gauze veil. Aye, said Dickon, and it'll be greener and greener till the grey's all gone. Can they guess what I was thinking? I know it was something nice, said Mary eagerly. I believe it was something about Colin. I was thinking that if he was out here, he wouldn't be watching for lumps to grow on his back. He'd be watching for buds to break on the rose bushes, and he'd likely be healthier, explained Dickon. I was wondering if us could ever get him in the humour to come out here and lie under the trees in his carriage. I've been wondering that myself. I thought of it almost every time I've talked to him, said Mary. I've wondered if he could keep a secret, and I've wondered if he could bring him here without anyone seeing us. I thought perhaps you could push his carriage. The doctor said he must have fresh air, and if he wants us to take him out, no one dare disobey him. He won't go out for other people, and perhaps they will be glad if he will go out with us. He could order the gardeners to keep away so they wouldn't find out. Dickon was thinking very hard as he scratched Captain's back. It'll be good for him, I'll warrant, he said. I should not be thinking he'd never been born. I should just be two children watching a garden grow, and he'd be another. Two lads and a little lass just looking on the springtime. I warrant it'll be better than doctor's stuff. He's been lying in his room so long, and he's always been so afraid of his back, that it's made him queer, said Mary. He knows of a good many things out of books, but he doesn't know anything else. He says he's been too ill to notice things, and he hates going out of doors, and hates gardens and gardeners. But he likes to hear about this garden because it's a secret. I didn't tell him much, but he said he wanted to see it. I shall have him out here sometime for sure, said Dickon. I could push his carriage well enough. Has thou noticed how the robin and his mate been working while we've been sitting here? Look at him perched on that branch, wondering where it would be best to put that twig he's got in his beak. He made one of his low, whistling calls, and the robin turned his head and looked at him inquiringly, still holding his twig. Dickon spoke to him as Ben Weatherstaff did, but Dickon's tone was one of friendly advice. Wherever they puts it, he said, it'll be all right. They knew how to build a nest before they came out of the egg. Get on with thee, lad. There's no time to lose. Oh, I do like to hear you talk to him, Mary said, laughing delightedly. Ben Weatherstaff scolds him and makes fun of him, and he hops about and looks as if he understood every word, and I know he likes it. Ben Weatherstaff says he is so conceited, he would rather have stones thrown at him than not be noticed. Dickon laughed too and went on talking. The knows us won't trouble thee, he said to the robin. Us near being wild things ourselves. Us is nest building too, bless thee. Look out that doesn't tell on us. And though the robin did not answer, because his beak was occupied, Mary knew that when he flew away with his twig to his own corner of the garden, the darkness of his dew-bright eye meant that he would not tell their secret for the world. Chapter 16. I won't, said Mary. They found a great deal to do that morning, and Mary was late in returning to the house, and was also in such a hurry to get back to her work that she quite forgot Colin until the last moment. "Tell Colin that I can't come and see him yet," she said to Martha. "I'm very busy in the garden." Martha looked rather frightened. "Miss Mary," she said, "it may put him all out of humour when I tell him that." But Mary was not as afraid of him as other people were, and she was not a self-sacrificing person. "I can't stay," she answered. "Dickon's waiting for me," and she ran away. The afternoon was even lovelier and busier than the morning had been. Already nearly all the weeds were cleared out of the garden, and most of the roses and trees had been pruned or dug about. Dickon had brought a spade of his own, and he had taught Mary to use all her tools, so that by this time it was plain that though the wild place was not likely to become a gardener's garden, it would be a wilderness of growing things before the springtime was over. "There'll be apple blossoms and cherry blossoms overhead," Dickon said, working away with all his might. "And there will be peach and plum trees in bloom against the walls, and the grass will be a carpet of flowers." The little fox and the rook were as happy and busy as they were, and the robin and his mate flew backwards and forwards like tiny streaks of lightning. Sometimes the rook flapped his black wings and soared away over the treetops in the park. Each time he came back and perched near Dickon and cawed several times, as if he were relating his adventures. And Dickon talked to him just as he had talked to the robin. Once when Dickon was so busy that he did not answer him at first, Soot flew onto his shoulders and gently tweaked his ear with his large beak. When Mary wanted to rest a little, Dickon sat down with her under a tree, and once he took his pipe out of his pocket and played the soft, strange little notes, and 2 squirrels appeared on the wall and looked and listened. "There's a bit good stronger than there was," Dickon said, looking at her as she was digging. "That's beginning to look different for sure." Mary was glowing with exercise and good spirits. "I'm getting fatter and fatter every day," she said quite exultantly. "Mrs. Medlock will have to get me some bigger dresses. Martha says my hair is growing thicker. It isn't so flat and stringy." The sun was beginning to set, and sending deep gold-colored rays slanting under the trees when they parted. "It'll be fine tomorrow," said Dickon. "I'll be at work by sunrise." "So will I," said Mary. She ran back to the house as quickly as her feet would carry her. She wanted to tell Colin about Dickon's fox cub and the rook, and about what the springtime had been doing. She felt sure he would like to hear. So it was not very pleasant when she opened the door of her room to see Martha standing waiting for her with a doleful face. "What's the matter?" she asked. "What did Colin say when you told him I couldn't come?" Said Martha. "I wish they'd gone. He was nigh going into one of his tantrums. There's been a nice to-do all afternoon to keep him quiet. He would watch the clock all the time." Mary's lips pinched themselves together. She was no more used to considering other people than Colin was, and she saw no reason why an ill-tempered boy should interfere with the thing she liked best. She knew nothing about the pitifulness of people who had been ill and nervous, and did not know that they could control their tempers, and need not make other people ill and nervous too. When she had had a headache in India, she had done her best to see that everybody else also had a headache, or something quite as bad. And she felt she was quite right. But of course, now she felt that Colin was quite wrong. He was not on his sofa when she went into his room. He was lying flat on his back in bed, and he did not turn his head towards her when she came in. This was a bad beginning, and Mary marched up to him with her stiff manner. "Why didn't you get up?" she said. "I did get up this morning when I thought you were coming," he answered, without looking at her. "I made them put me back in bed this afternoon. My back ached and my head ached and I was tired. Why didn't you come?" "I was working in the garden with Dickon," said Mary. Colin frowned and condescended to look at her. "I won't let that boy come here if you go and stay with him instead of coming to talk with me," he said. Mary flew into a fine passion. She could fly into a passion without making a noise. She just grew sour and obstinate and did not care what happened. "If you send Dickon away, I'll never come into this room again," she retorted. "You'll have to if I want you," said Colin. "I won't," said Mary. "I'll make you," said Colin. "They shall drag you in." "Shall they, Mr. Roger?" said Mary fiercely. "They may drag me in, but they can't make me talk when they get me here. I'll sit and clench my teeth and never tell you one thing. I won't even look at you. I'll stare at the floor." They were a nice, agreeable pair as they glared at each other. If they'd been two little street boys, they would have sprung at each other and had a rough-and-tumble fight. As it was, they did the next thing to it. "You are a selfish thing," cried Colin. "What are you?" said Mary. "Selfish people always say that. Anyone is selfish who doesn't do what they want. You're more selfish than I am. You're the most selfish boy that I ever saw." "I'm not," snapped Colin. "I'm not as selfish as your fine Dickon is. He keeps you playing in the dirt when he knows I am all by myself. He's selfish, if you like." Mary's eyes flashed fire. "He's nicer than any boy that ever lived," she said. He's like an angel." It might sound rather silly to say that, but she did not care. "A nice angel," Colin sneered ferociously. "He's a common cottage boy off the moor." "He's better than a common Roger," retorted Mary. "He's 1,000 times better." Because she was the stronger of the two, she was beginning to get the better of him. The truth was that he had never had a fight with anyone like himself in his life. And upon the whole, it was rather good for him, though neither he nor Mary knew anything about that. He turned his head on his pillow and shut his eyes, and a big tear was squeezed out and ran down his cheek. He was beginning to feel pathetic and sorry for himself, not for anyone else. "I'm not as selfish as you because I'm always ill, and I'm sure there's a lump coming on my back," he said. "And I'm going to die besides." "You're not," contradicted Mary unsympathetically. He opened his eyes quite wide with indignation. He had never heard such a thing said before. He was at once furious and slightly pleased, if a person could be both at one time. "I'm not," he cried. "I am. You know I am. Everybody says so." "I don't believe it," said Mary sourly. "You just say that to make people sorry. I believe you're proud of it. I don't believe it. If you were a nice boy, it might be true, but you're too nasty." In spite of his invalid back, Colin sat up in bed in quite a healthy rage. "Get out of the room," he shouted, and he caught hold of his pillow and threw it at her. He was not strong enough to throw it far, and it only fell at her feet. But Mary's face looked as pinched as a nutcracker. "I'm going," she said, "and I won't come back." She walked to the door, and when she reached it, she turned around and spoke again. "I was going to tell you all sorts of nice things," she said. "Dickon brought his fox and his rook, and I was going to tell you all about them. Now I won't tell you a single thing." She marched out of the door and closed it behind her. And there, to her great astonishment, she found the trained nurse standing as if she had been listening. And more amazing still, she was laughing. She was a big, handsome young woman who ought not to have been a trained nurse at all, as she could not bear invalids, and she was always making excuses to leave Colin to Martha or anyone else who would take her place. Mary had never liked her, and she simply stood and gazed up at her as she stood giggling into her handkerchief. "What are you laughing at?" she asked her. "At you two young ones," said the nurse. "It's the best thing that could happen to this sickly, pampered thing, to have someone to stand up to him that's as spoiled as himself." And she laughed into her handkerchief again. If he'd had a young vixen of a sister to fight with, it would have been the saving of him. "Is he going to die?" "I don't know, and I don't care," said the nurse. "Hysterics and temper are half what ails him." "What are hysterics?" asked Mary. "You'll find out if you work him into a tantrum after this. But at any rate, you've given him something to have hysterics about, and I'm glad of it." Mary went back to her room, not feeling at all as she had felt when she had come in from the garden. She was cross and disappointed, but not at all sorry for Colin. She had looked forward to telling him a great many things, and she had meant to try and make up her mind whether it would be safe to trust him with the great secret. She had been beginning to think it would be, but now she had changed her mind entirely. She would never tell him, and he could stay in his room and never get any fresh air and die if he liked. It would serve him right. She felt so sour and unrelenting that for a few minutes she almost forgot about Dickon and the green veil creeping over the world, and the soft wind blowing down from the moor. Martha was waiting for her, and the trouble in her face had been temporarily replaced by interest and curiosity. There was a wooden box on the table, and its cover had been removed, and revealed that it was full of neat packages. "Mr. Craven sent it to you," said Martha. "It looks as if it had picture books in it." Mary remembered what he had asked her the day she had gone to his room. "Do you want anything? Dolls, toys, books?" She opened the package, wondering if he had sent a doll, and also wondering what she should do with it if he had. But he had not sent one. There were several beautiful books such as Colin had, and 2 of them were about gardens and were full of pictures. There were 2 or 3 games, and there was a beautiful little writing case with a gold monogram on it, and a gold pen and inkstand. Everything was so nice that her pleasure began to crowd her anger out of her mind. She had not expected him to remember her at all, and her hard little heart grew quite warm. "I can write better than I can print," she said, "and the first thing I shall write with that pen will be a letter to tell him I am much obliged." If she had been friends with Colin, she would have run to show him her presents at once, and they would have looked at the pictures and read some of the gardening books and perhaps tried playing the games. And he would have enjoyed himself so much he would never once have thought he was going to die, or have put his hand on his spine to see if there was a lump coming. He had a way of doing that which she could not bear. It gave her an uncomfortable, frightened feeling, because he always looked so frightened himself. He said that if he felt even quite a little lump some day, he would know his hunch had begun to grow. Something he had heard Mrs. Medlock whispering to the nurse had given him the idea, and he had thought over it in secret until it was quite firmly fixed in his mind. Mrs. Medlock had said his father's back had begun to show its crookedness in that way when he was a child. He had never told anyone but Mary that most of his tantrums, as they called them, grew out of his hysterical hidden fear. Mary had been sorry for him when he had told her. He always began to think about it when he was cross or tired, she said to herself. and he has been cross today. Perhaps he's been thinking about it all afternoon. She stood still, looking down at the carpet and thinking. I said I would never go back again. She hesitated, knitting her brows. But perhaps, just perhaps, I will go and see if he wants me in the morning. Perhaps he'll try to throw his pillow at me again, but I think I'll go. Chapter 17. A Tantrum. She had got up very early in the morning and had worked hard in the garden, and she was tired and sleepy. So soon as Martha had brought her supper and she had eaten it, she was glad to go to bed. As she laid her head on the pillow, she murmured to herself, I'll go out before breakfast and work with Dickon, and then afterward I believe I'll go see him. She thought it was the middle of the night when she was awakened by such dreadful sounds that she jumped out of bed in an instant. What was it? What was it? The next minute she felt quite sure she knew. Doors were opening and shut, and there was hurrying feet in the corridors, and someone was crying and screaming at the same time, screaming and crying in a horrible way. It's Colin, she said. He's having one of those tantrums the nurse called hysterics. How awful it sounds. As she listened to the sobbing screams, she did not wonder that people were so frightened that they gave him his own way in everything rather than hear them. She put her hands over her ears and felt sick and shivering. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do, she kept saying. I can't bear it. Once she wondered if he would stop if she dared go to him, and then she remembered how he had driven her out of the room, and thought that perhaps the sight of her might make him worse. Even when she pressed her hands more tightly over her ears, she could not keep the awful sounds out. She hated them so and was so terrified by them that suddenly they began to make her angry, and she felt as if she could fly into a tantrum herself and frighten him as he was frightening her. She was not used to anyone's tempers but her own. She took her hands from her ears and sprang up and stamped her foot. He ought to be stopped. Somebody ought to make him stop. Somebody ought to beat him, she cried out. Just then she heard feet almost running down the corridor, and a door opened, and the nurse came in. She was not laughing now by any means. She even looked rather pale. He's worked himself into hysterics, she said in a great hurry. He'll do himself harm. No one can do anything with him. You come and try like a good child. He likes you. He turned me out of the room this morning, said Mary, stamping her foot with excitement. The stamp rather pleased the nurse. The truth was she had been afraid she might find Mary crying and hiding her head under the bedclothes. That's right, she said. You're in the right humor. You go and scold him. Give him something new to think of. Do go, child, as quick as ever you can. It was not until afterward that Mary realized that the thing had been funny as well as dreadful. That it was funny that all the grown-up people were so frightened that they came to a little girl just because they guessed she was almost as bad as Colin himself. She flew along the corridor, and the nearer she got to the screams, the higher her temper mounted. She felt quite wicked by the time she reached the door. She slapped it open with her hand and ran across the room to the four-poster bed. You stop, she almost shouted. You stop. I hate you. Everybody hates you. I wish everybody would run out of the house and let you scream yourself to death. You will scream yourself to death in a minute, and I wish you would. A nice, sympathetic child could neither have thought nor said such things. But it just happened that the shock of hearing them was the best possible thing for this hysterical boy, whom no one had ever dared to restrain or contradict. He had been lying on his face, beating his pillow with his hands, and he actually almost jumped around. He turned so quickly at the sound of the furious little voice. His face looked dreadful, white and red and swollen, and he was gasping and choking. But savage little Mary did not care an atom. "If you scream another scream," she said, "I'll scream too. And I can scream louder than you can, and I'll frighten you. I'll frighten you." He actually had stopped screaming because she had startled him so. The scream which had been coming almost choked him. The tears were streaming down his face, and he shook all over. "I can't stop," he gasped and sobbed. I can't. "You can," shouted Mary. "Half that ails you is hysterics and temper. Just hysterics. And she stamped each time she said it. "I felt the lump. I felt it," choked out Colin. "I knew I should. I shall have a hunch on my back, and then I shall die." And he began to writhe again, and turned on his face and sobbed and wailed. But he didn't scream. "You didn't feel a lump," contradicted Mary fiercely. "If you did, it was only a hysterical lump. Hysterics make lumps. There's nothing the matter with your hard back. Nothing but hysterics. Turn over and let me look at it." She liked the word hysterics, and it felt somehow as if it had an effect on him. He was probably like herself and had never heard it before. "Nurse," she commanded, "come here and show me his back this minute." The nurse, Mrs. Medlock, and Martha had been standing huddled together near the door, staring at her, their mouths half open. All three had gasped with fright more than once. The nurse came forward as if she were half afraid. Colin was heaving with great breathless sobs. "Perhaps he won't let me," she hesitated in a low voice. Colin heard her, however, and he gasped out between two sobs. "Show her. She'll see it then." It was a poor thin back to look at when it was bared. Every rib could be counted, and every joint of the spine, though Mistress Mary did not count them, as she bent over and examined them with a solemn, savage little face. She looked so sour and old-fashioned that the nurse turned her head aside to hide the twitching of her mouth. There was just a minute's silence, for even Colin tried to hold his breath while Mary looked up and down his spine, and down and up, and intently as if she had been the great doctor from London. "There's not a single lump there," she said at last. "There's not a lump as big as a pin, except backbone lumps, and you can only feel them because you're thin. I've got backbone lumps myself, and they used to stick out as much as yours do until I began to get fatter, and I'm not fat enough yet to hide them. There's not a lump as big as a pin. If you ever say there is again, I shall laugh." No one but Colin himself knew what effect these crossly spoken, childish words had on him. If he had ever had anyone talk about his secret terrors, if he had ever dared to let himself ask questions, if it had childish companions and not lain in his back in the huge enclosed house, breathing an atmosphere heavy with the fears of people who were most of them ignorant and tired of him, he would have found out that most of his fright and illness was created by himself. But he had lain and thought of himself and his aches and weariness for hours and days and months and years. And now that an angry, unsympathetic little girl insisted obstinately that he was not as ill as he thought he was, he actually felt as if she might be speaking the truth. "I didn't know," ventured the nurse, "that he thought he had a lump on his spine. His back is weak because he won't try to sit up. I could have told him there was no lump there." Colin gulped and turned his face a little to look at her. "Could you?" he said pathetically. "Yes, sir." "There," said Mary, and she gulped too. Colin turned on his face again, but for his long, drawn, broken breaths, which were the dying down of his storm of sobbing, he lay still for a minute, though great tears streamed down his face and wet the pillow. Actually, the tears meant that a curious great relief had come to him. Presently he turned and looked at the nurse again, and strangely enough he was not like a Raja at all as he spoke to her. "Do you think I could live to grow up?" he said. The nurse was neither clever nor soft-hearted, but she could repeat some of the London doctor's words. "You probably will if you will do what you're told to do and not give way to your temper, and stay out a great deal in the fresh air." Colin's tantrum had passed, and he was weak and worn out with crying, and this perhaps made him feel gentle. He put out his hand a little towards Mary, and I am glad to say that her own tantrum having passed, she was softened too, and met him halfway with her hand, so that was a sort of making up. I'll go out with you, Mary," he said. "I shan't hate fresh air if we can find—" He remembered just in time to stop himself from saying, "if we can find the secret garden." And he ended, "I shall like to go out with you if Dickon will come and push my chair. I do so want to see Dickon and the fox and the crow." The nurse remade the tumbled bed and shook and straightened the pillows. Then she made Colin a cup of beef tea and gave a cup to Mary, who really was very glad to get it after her excitement. Mrs. Medlock and Martha gladly slipped away, and after everything was neat and calm and in order, the nurse looked as if she would very gladly slip away also. She was a healthy young woman who resented being robbed of her sleep, and she yawned quite openly as she looked at Mary, who pushed her big footstool close to the four-poster bed, and was holding Colin's hand. "You must go and get your sleep out," she said. "He'll drop off after a while, if he's not too upset. Then I'll lie down myself in the next room." "Would you like me to sing you that song I learned from my ayah?" Mary whispered to Colin. His hand pulled hers gently, and he turned his tired eyes on her appealingly. "Oh yes," he answered. "It's such a soft song. I shall go to sleep in a minute." "I will put him to sleep," Mary said to the yawning nurse. "You can go if you like." "Well," said the nurse with an attempt at reluctance, "if he doesn't go to sleep in half an hour, you must call me." "Very well," answered Mary. The nurse was out of the room in a minute, and as soon as she was gone, Colin pulled Mary's hand again. "I almost told," he said, "but I stopped myself in time. I won't talk and I'll go to sleep. But you said you had a whole lot of nice things to tell me. Have you? Do you think you have found out anything all about the way into the secret garden?" Mary looked at his poor, tired little face and swollen eyes, and her heart relented. "Yes," she answered. "I think I have, and if you'll go to sleep, I will tell you tomorrow." His hand quite trembled. "Oh, Mary," he said. "Oh, Mary. If I could get into it, I think I should live to grow up. Do you suppose that instead of singing the ayah song, you could just tell me softly, as you did that first day, what you imagine it looks like inside? I'm sure it will make me go to sleep." "Yes," answered Mary. "Shut your eyes." And I think I'm going to leave it there. As always, if you want to pick up where I've left off, you can find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use, so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night, and sweet dreams.